The first time Marcus Holt told me I wasn't good enough for his son, I was standing in the rain outside Ashbourne Manor with mud on my boots and a casserole dish covered in foil. And what I remember most clearly about that moment, more than the cold, more than the weight of the dish in my hands, more than the sound of my own breathing going very careful and very controlled, is that I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because I had been standing at the gates of that house for 4 minutes, watching the white gravel driveway stretch away from me toward something enormous and grey and lit from within. And I had told myself, the whole drive over, that this was going to be fine. That it was just dinner. That Daniel loved me, and that love was sufficient armor for whatever a dining room full of his father's friends could produce. I had almost believed it. And then Marcus Holt looked at the foil-covered dish in my hands and said, in a voice that carried with the precision of something that had been aimed, "Daniel, you didn't say she was bringing food from home." And I understood, in that single sentence, that no amount of love is armor against a man who has decided, before you've opened your mouth, that you are beneath his notice. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is not where the story starts. That is the middle of the storm, and you need to understand what the sky looked like before it broke. My name is Clara Reyes. I am a nurse. I work the overnight shift at St. Brendan's Memorial, which means that for the better part of any given week, I exist in a world stripped of performance, a world where the only question that matters is whether the person in the bed in front of me is going to make it through to morning, and whether I can do anything, with my hands and my training and whatever steadiness I have managed to carry in from the car park, to improve those odds. I have sat with people in their last hours, and I have watched families arrive too late, and I have learned, over 6 years of overnight shifts, that the size of a person's house, the car in their driveway, the label on their coat, the number of people who call their name at parties, has absolutely nothing to do with the size of their soul. I learned this not as a principle but as a fact, the way you learn facts in rooms where everything false has already been stripped away. I had been with Daniel Holt for 14 months when his father put my casserole on a back counter. 14 months, which sounds like a number but which is actually a texture, a specific accumulation of mornings and evenings and ordinary, extraordinary moments that together make the shape of something I had stopped trying to name, because the names I knew all felt too small. It was the coffees. Every morning before he drove to work, Daniel left a coffee on my doorstep in a travel cup, with a note tucked under the lid. Never long notes, never the kind of thing that performs itself, just practical, small, tender things, the kind of notes that say, "I thought of you this morning, and I wanted you to know." It was the paperback novels. He had discovered, somewhere around month 3, that what I needed after a 12-hour shift was not silence and not conversation, but someone reading aloud to me. And so he would sit on the edge of my bathtub while I soaked in water that was always slightly too hot. And he would read to me from whatever he was reading, and his voice would be the thing that separated the shift from the rest, the thing that told my nervous system, "You are done now. You can put it down." It was the way he held my hand in public, not possessively, not performatively, but with a specific attentiveness, his thumb moving in a slow arc across my knuckle, as though he was reminding himself I was there. I met Daniel on a Tuesday in November, outside a coffee shop on Breckenridge Street, in the rain. This detail matters. It was raining the way it rains in November, not dramatically, not the kind of rain that makes a good story, just the persistent, dispiriting kind that soaks through your coat before you realize it has started. And I was standing on the pavement trying to open my umbrella, which had developed sometime in the previous week, the structural instability of a man who has had too much to drink. And Daniel was the person who stopped, and without being asked, and without making it a thing, simply held the door of the coffee shop open and waited while I wrestled the umbrella into submission. That was it. That was the whole of the beginning. He held a door. I thanked him. He said the umbrella looked like it was winning. I said he should see it on a good day. We both got coffee, and we both sat at the same table by the window because every other table was taken, and by the time the rain eased enough that we might have left, neither of us had any particular interest in leaving. He told me he worked in finance. He did not tell me whose finance, or that his father's name opened certain doors in certain cities, or that the building where he worked occupied 6 floors of a tower in the financial district, and that his name appeared on a placard outside an office with a view of 3 bridges. He said, "I work in finance." I said, "I work nights at the hospital." He said that sounded harder. I said it was different. We talked for 2 hours. When we finally left, he said, with a directness that was not quite boldness but was something adjacent to it, that he would very much like to have coffee with me again, on purpose this time, without the umbrella situation as a requirement. I said I would like that too. I was wearing, on my right hand, a plain gold signet ring, old enough that the crest engraved on it had been worn almost smooth by time and by whoever had worn it before me. It sat on my ring finger like something that had always been there. Daniel noticed it that first afternoon. I saw him notice it, the quick glance, the way he did not ask. And he did not ask about it for 4 months. And when he finally did, I said only that it had belonged to my family. This was true. It was not the whole truth. But I had spent 29 years learning when to speak and when to let a question live unanswered, and the ring was not something I could explain in a coffee shop in November without also explaining everything else. And I was not yet ready for everything else. I was not sure I would ever be ready. But that was before Marcus Holt put my casserole on a back counter, and before I sat in my car on the dark drive home and understood, with a clarity I had been carefully avoiding for 3 weeks, that I had let the phone ring long enough, that the patience my grandfather had extended to me, the extraordinary, generous, undemanding patience of a man who understood that some decisions cannot be rushed, had been honored long enough by my avoidance, and that it was time, finally, to call it what it was, not caution, not wisdom, not respect for my mother's choices. Fear. And I was, I realized, with the fields dark on either side of the road, and the heating in my car making its small, reliable sound, done being afraid. When Daniel called on the Tuesday evening, his voice had the careful brightness of someone who has been rehearsing. His father had agreed. A proper dinner. Formal, seated, the whole thing. "He's trying, Clara," Daniel said. "I know it doesn't look like it yet, but he's trying." I heard, underneath the brightness, the thing he needed, the reassurance that I would meet this halfway, that I would show up and give it a fair chance, that his belief in eventual goodness would not be made to look naive. I said yes, of course I said yes. I made the lemon tart after a 10-hour shift. This was, I understood, even as I was doing it, either a testament to my optimism or to my capacity for self-punishment. And I chose, as I pressed the pastry into the tin at 11 o'clock at night, to call it optimism. I zested the lemon. I cracked the eggs. I made the filling and poured it and watched it settle in the oven while I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the counter, too tired to move, thinking about how my mother used to say that a dish made with care carries the care in it, that people can taste the attention, that there is no such thing as a gesture too small to matter. I got up and checked the oven. I told myself my mother was right. The drive to Ashbourne Manor took 40 minutes. I had dressed with the specific deliberateness of someone who knows they are walking into a test and has decided to be honest about that rather than pretend they are not. The deep green wrap dress, the good shoes, my hair done the way I do it when I want to look like I haven't thought about my hair, the lemon tart in a carrier bag on the passenger seat, the casserole, a slow-cooked lamb thing, Daniel's favorite, chosen because he had mentioned once that his father hadn't had a home-cooked meal since his mother died, wrapped in foil on the back seat, filling the car with a warmth that felt, in the dark, almost like courage. The gates were as tall as the oak trees flanking them. I had not been prepared for the gates. I had been to the manor once before, briefly, for a function where Marcus had spent exactly 10 minutes making me feel like a smudge on the wallpaper, but that visit had been in daylight with other cars and a crowd to disappear into, and it had not had this quality, this specific quality of arriving at something that had not been built for you, that had been built, in fact, in active opposition to anyone like you. The white gravel crackled under my tires like the sound of entering somewhere you hadn't been invited. The manor rose at the end of the drive like something from a painting. Grey stone, mullioned windows, 2 wings spreading from a central entrance portico, as though the house was opening its arms to receive exactly the people it had already decided deserved to be received, and none of the others. There were other cars already. A gunmetal Bentley. 2 dark Range Rovers. A low silver thing I couldn't identify, but that looked like it cost more than my apartment building. Daniel met me at the door with a kiss and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I thought, he's nervous too. I thought, this is going to be fine. I thought both of these things at exactly the same moment as Marcus Holt appeared in the doorway behind his son and looked at the casserole dish in my hands, and said what he said. And the people behind him laughed. The ones who didn't laugh looked away, which is its own kind of cruelty. I want you to sit with what the next 3 hours felt like, because nothing that comes later makes sense unless you understand what came before. Marcus Holt had invited, in addition to Daniel and me, 6 of his closest business associates and their wives, a man he introduced as his attorney, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone introducing a particularly impressive acquisition, and a woman named Sylvie, who had gone to school with Daniel's late mother, and who inserted herself into every pause in conversation with the practiced ease of someone who has spent decades making other people feel they are occupying space that rightly belongs to someone else. The dining room was enormous. The table was longer than I had expected. The flowers were white and arranged with the precision of something that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. The candles were real wax, and they cast a light on everything that made it all look like a painting of itself, beautiful and impenetrable. I was seated at the far end of the table from Daniel. This was not an accident. The woman to my left introduced herself, and then spent the entire first course asking me increasingly pointed questions about my family background, in a tone that suggested she was conducting a survey for a documentary about people who had inadvertently wandered into rooms they had no business being in. Where had I grown up? Where had I trained? Did I have family in the area? She paused between questions with the air of someone taking careful notes. The man to my right spoke exclusively to the man across from him for the entire evening. He did not acknowledge my existence once. Not with a word, not with a glance. I sat between them, and I watched Daniel at the other end of the table, and I kept my face arranged in the expression of a person who is having a perfectly pleasant time. My casserole, I learned later, had been quietly redirected to a back counter in the kitchen, and not served. The lemon tart appeared on the dessert table among other desserts with no attribution, as though it had materialized from a caterer, as though I had not pressed the pastry into the tin at 11 o'clock at night while sitting on the floor of my kitchen, as though my hands had not cracked the eggs and zested the lemon and carried the thing 40 minutes through the dark, because I believed that a dish made with care carries the care in it. It sat there, unnamed, while people took slices and praised the dessert selection generally, and I watched it from across the room, and I said nothing. After dessert, Marcus Holt invited Daniel to join him in his study for a drink. The room rearranged itself into smaller conversations. I found myself standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine I had been nursing for 2 hours, and that was when Sylvie appeared at my elbow, smiling pleasantly, as though commenting on the floral arrangement. "You know he's going to cut Daniel off if this continues, don't you?" she said. "Marcus has already spoken to the family solicitors. He's not joking, darling. He never jokes about money." I looked at her. I said nothing. I had learned, in 14 months of loving Daniel Holt, that the people in Marcus's orbit responded to his moods the way weather vanes respond to wind. They pointed wherever the pressure came from, automatically, without deliberation or shame. Sylvie had not decided to threaten me. She had simply oriented herself toward the prevailing pressure, the way she always did, and the pressure was coming from the direction of wanting me gone. Daniel came out of the study 40 minutes later. His face was carefully blank, in the way faces go blank only after something has been carved out of them. The specific blankness of a man who has been told something he cannot yet afford to feel. He looked at me across the room, and I walked to him, and I took his hand, and he held mine so tightly I felt it in my elbow. He said quietly, "Can we go?" And I said yes. I rode home behind his car through the black country roads with the heating on and the radio off, and the silence in my own head surprisingly loud. I thought about the casserole on the back counter. I thought about the lemon tart with no name. I thought about Sylvie at my elbow saying, "He never jokes about money." I did not cry. I was too tired to cry. I had spent 6 years at St. Brendan's watching people come to the end of the road they were on, and I knew that grief came in waves, and that this particular wave, the wave of having sat at a table for 3 hours, being systematically made to feel like a smudge on the wallpaper, while the person I loved was held hostage by a study door, had not yet reached me. It was still out there. It would come. But tonight I was just tired. I thought, Marcus Holt has no idea who he is dealing with. And then I almost laughed at myself, because what did I mean by that? I was Clara Reyes. I was a nurse with mud on her boots and a casserole dish. I was precisely nobody, as far as Ashbourne Manor was concerned. I had no weapons. I had no leverage. I had my hands and my training and whatever steadiness I could carry in from the car park, and those things mattered enormously in the rooms where I worked, and they meant less than nothing in the rooms Marcus Holt moved through. Except that I had a phone call I had been avoiding for 3 weeks, and a name I had been carrying quietly for 29 years, like a stone in a coat pocket, present always, weighing always, never quite absent from the awareness. And a reason, very specific and very old and very powerful, that I had learned never to say out loud in rooms full of people who thought they knew what power looked like. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. The voice on the other end was warm and formal at once, the kind of voice that has been trained to be both, and that holds them in perfect balance without effort, the voice of a man who speaks to heads of government on Mondays and to me on Tuesdays, and who makes no distinction between the two calls in terms of attentiveness or care. He said, "Clara, you've been avoiding me." I said, "I've been thinking." He said, "And?" And I looked out the window at the dark fields passing, and I thought about casserole dishes on back counters, and a table I had been seated at the wrong end of on purpose, and a woman named Sylvie smiling at me with a mouth full of someone else's threats, and I said, "I think it's time. I think I'm done waiting." There was a pause, a breath, and then he said, in the tone of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now, finally, tremendously relieved, "I'll make the calls tonight. His name is Edouard Beaumont Reyes. He is my grandfather. He is also, and this is the part that Marcus Holt would spend the following week trying to understand and failing, because some facts are so large they resist comprehension until they arrive at your door in the form of consequences, one of the most significant private landholders in Western Europe, the founding principle of an investment consortium that controls interests across 4 continents, a man whose personal fortune, if you wrote it as a number, has 14 digits, a former advisor to 3 separate sovereign governments, 2 of which had subsequently named him to various ceremonial and real positions of influence, which he had accepted with the graceful modesty of someone who has learned that power is most effectively held quietly. He had not pressed me. He had never, in 29 years, once pressed me. When my mother left his world, left it deliberately, with full understanding of what she was walking away from, because she had watched what proximity to that kind of wealth does to the interior of a person, and she had decided she would rather be whole than rich. He had honored her choice with the same precision and thoroughness he brought to every other agreement. He had remained in her life as her father. He had remained in my life as my grandfather. He had not mentioned, in any room I was also in, the weight of what his name carried. He had told me, when I was old enough to understand, "The door is open. Always. And when you are ready to walk through it, I will be standing on the other side." I had thought for a long time that I would never be ready. I had become a nurse because I believed in it, because I had sat at enough bedsides to understand that there is a kind of work that is its own justification, that needs no status and no prestige and no second life running parallel to it in which you are someone else more impressive. I had built my life small and real and mine. I had chosen a man I loved for the coffees and the paperback novels and the way he held my hand, not for anything connected to surnames or balance sheets. I had carried the ring on my right hand like a private acknowledgement of where I came from, a reminder that I knew the weight and had chosen to put it down. But Marcus Holt had put my casserole on a back counter and named it "Food from Home," like that was an insult, and seated me at the wrong end of his table and watched his friends perform my erasure and offered me a financial settlement to disappear. And I understood as the dark fields passed on either side of me, and my grandfather's voice settled into the warmth of the connection. Done. It was not chaos. I want to be precise about this. What my grandfather did in the 48 hours after that phone call was not rage, not retaliation in any crude sense, not the thunderous display of wealth that people imagine when they imagine old money making its displeasure known. It was architecture. Careful, load-bearing, invisible architecture. He made 7 phone calls. Each one was a beam in a structure that, by the following Thursday, would be unrecognizable from what it had been the week before. I knew about 2 of the calls at the time. The other 5 I learned about later, piece by piece, in the way you sometimes learn the full shape of a storm only once the quiet has come and you can walk back out into it. The first call I knew about was to Sir Aldous Fenwick, who chaired the board of Meridian Capital Partners. Holt Industries had been seeking access to Meridian for 18 months, a relationship that Daniel had described to me, once, as the single most significant business development his father had ever pursued, the one that kept Marcus awake, the one he had built a strategy around, the one that, if it came through, would define the next decade of the company. The call between my grandfather and Sir Aldous was brief and cordial. They had known each other for 40 years. Nothing explicit was said. There was simply a conversation between old friends, in the course of which my grandfather mentioned that he had recently taken a closer interest in certain market relationships, and Sir Aldous, who was not a man who required things spelled out, who had in fact spent his career reading between the lines of conversations conducted in exactly this register, said he understood completely. The Meridian partnership would remain on pause indefinitely, pending a reassessment of strategic alignment. No announcement, no drama. The door simply stopped opening. The second call I knew about was to a woman named Genevieve Marchetti. Genevieve managed the portfolio that included the deed to Ashbourne Manor itself. My grandfather did not own Ashbourne Manor. This is important. This is what made it so completely unexpected. He held a significant secondary interest in the private equity structure that held the firm that managed the estate's debt obligations. It was a chain of intermediaries so long and so deliberately obscure that Marcus Holt had spent 15 years as its ultimate beneficiary without ever being able to follow it back to its origin. He had no reason to follow it back. There was no reason before that Tuesday night for the name Beaumont Reyes to mean anything to him in relation to the house he had inherited from his father. On Wednesday morning, Genevieve's office sent a letter requesting a meeting to discuss the estate's financing arrangements. The letter was written in the driest possible language, the language of financial administration, the language of routine institutional correspondence that contains nothing alarming on its surface. It was also, to anyone who understood what they were reading, an earthquake delivered by registered post. Marcus Holt connected the two names on Wednesday morning. I know this because Daniel told me, later, that his father had come downstairs that morning looking like a man who had put his hand through a mirror in the dark. Not injured exactly, but altered, rearranged, his understanding of the room he was standing in suddenly and completely different from what it had been the evening before. He had not yet said anything to Daniel. He had made several calls, none of which, Daniel gathered from the fragments he overheard, were returned in the way Marcus had expected. He had poured himself a drink at 11 in the morning, which Daniel said he had never seen before. And then he had asked Daniel, with a careful steadiness that was itself a kind of distress signal, whether he might be able to arrange a meeting with Clara. I dressed simply on Thursday. Dark trousers, a white blouse, the signet ring on my right hand, where it always was. I had asked my grandfather if he would come in person. He had said he preferred not to attend unless it became necessary, which told me, because I knew how he communicated, that he had already sent people who would represent his presence without requiring him to be present. When I turned onto the Ashbourne driveway on Thursday afternoon, the white gravel still crackled under my tires. The oaks still stood like sentinels on either side. But there were cars along the verge that I did not recognize. A black town car with European plates, two dark SUVs with their engines idling and their windows down despite the cold, each driver sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been trained to be patient and is not inconvenienced by waiting. They were not Daniel's cars. They were not Marcus Holt's cars. They were my grandfather saying, without saying anything, without being present, "I am here." Marcus was waiting in the entrance hall. He had arranged himself with care, the good suit, the correct posture, the expression of a man extending a courtesy he had not been required to extend. He was wearing his power like a suit 2 sizes too large. He looked at me the way he had looked at my casserole dish. He said, without offering his hand, "I appreciate you coming, Miss Reyes." The emphasis on Miss was so precisely calibrated it could only have been deliberate, a last small assertion of the social calculus he had spent his life operating by, a reminder that he still knew where everyone stood in relation to everyone else, and that I stood where he had decided I stood. I said nothing. I looked at him and I waited. I had learned, in 14 months of loving his son and 29 years of carrying a name I had kept quiet, that silence is frequently the most devastating thing you can offer a man who expects you to fill it with apology. He was expecting apology, or protest, or the flustered backpedaling of someone who has been called to a meeting by a powerful man and is not sure why. He got none of these. He got my eyes and my stillness and the sound of the entrance hall, which was very quiet, and the faint presence, visible through the tall windows if you knew to look, of a black town car with European plates parked on his gravel with its engine running. He said, "I'll be direct." He said it the way men say it when they have decided that honesty serves them best, not as a character trait, but as a strategy. My son is young. He's idealistic. I understand that. But there are expectations for this family that predate his idealism, and I hope, that you understand that what you and Daniel have, charming as it may be, is not what this family requires going forward. I'm asking you clearly and kindly to step away. I'm willing to make it worth your time financially. I think you're a sensible girl, and I think you understand the shape of this situation. He said sensible girl. He said it with the air of a man who is being generous. He said worth your time financially. He said it with the air of a man who is performing grace under what he has decided to experience as an inconvenience. I said, "Is that everything?" He blinked. "Mr. Holt, I'd like to show you something." I took out my phone. I opened the email. It had arrived that morning from my grandfather's office. 3 sentences, written in the language of financial formality, explaining that Beaumont Reyes Capital was consolidating its review of all indirect interests currently managed by affiliated portfolio structures, and that pending the outcome of that review, all third-party partnership discussions, including those with Meridian Capital, would reflect the group's updated relationship priorities. 3 sentences. Signed, Edward Beaumont Reyes. I passed him the phone. I watched his face do something I had never seen a face do quite so completely. Not collapse. Reorganize. The way a building looks in the first seconds after the load-bearing wall has gone. Still standing, still structurally present, but with everything rearranged in relation to everything else, and the outcome not yet clear. He said very quietly, "This is... How do you..." "He's my grandfather, Mr. Holt, on my mother's side. I've never used the name because my mother didn't want me to, and I respected that, and I still do. I became a nurse because I believed in it. I still believe in it. But I am also, as it turns out, the person you just offered a financial settlement to step away from your family." I let that sit for a moment. I also want to be clear that none of this was my idea. I didn't ask my grandfather to make any calls. He makes his own decisions. He always has. But he is very attentive to how the people he loves are treated. And he is not, as you may be discovering, a man who responds well to his granddaughter being offered money to disappear. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, through the tall windows, the black town car sat with its engine running. Its driver had not moved. He would not move until I left. He would still be there, and his stillness would still be communicating what it had been sent to communicate for as long as it needed to. A door opened above us. Daniel's voice came down the staircase, uncertain and careful. "Clara, what's happening?" I looked up at him. At this man with the paperback novels and the morning coffees and the hand so tight I felt it in my elbow, this man who had loved me before he knew anything, who had chosen me over and over in small daily ways that had nothing to do with what my grandfather's name was worth. I smiled at him with everything I had. I said, "Everything's fine, Daniel. Come down. Your father and I were just finishing a conversation." Marcus Holt did not get his meeting with Meridian Capital. This is not something that happened dramatically with announcement or confrontation. It was a door that closed the way expensive doors close, without sound, without drama, with the complete and permanent finality of something that has been decided at a level too high for argument. He hired 2 financial consultants separately to trace the chain of holding structures and explain to him how and why a nurse in a green wrap dress had been able to walk into his entrance hall and hand him 3 sentences that unmade 18 months of work. The consultants came back with the same answer. By the time Marcus Holt fully understood the answer, the review had expanded to include 3 additional areas of indirect interest he hadn't known were connected. It was not punitive. My grandfather does not do punitive, which is one of the things that makes him so effective. It was simply thorough. And thoroughness, at that scale, has a weight of its own. Sylvie attended a luncheon 3 weeks later and spent 20 minutes asking her host about what she called the Clara Reyes situation, by which name it had apparently begun to be discussed in certain circles. She had the barely concealed appetite of a woman who smells disaster on someone else and is profoundly relieved it is not her. Her host declined to speculate. Sylvie drove home and spent the evening revising her opinions about several things she had previously considered settled, which was the most useful intellectual exercise she had undertaken in some time. The attorney, the one Marcus had introduced with such proprietary pride, quietly withdrew from 2 of the Holt family's ongoing matters, citing a conflict of interest that he declined to specify to anyone who asked. The man who had sat to my right at dinner and spoken exclusively to the man across from him for an entire evening ran into Daniel at his club 3 months later, and was so aggressively, almost frantically cordial, that Daniel came home and described it to me with a genuine bewilderment so pure it was almost funny. I said, "People are very good at adjusting." He said, "Is that what that was?" I said, "That is absolutely what that was." There were other ripples, smaller ones, that I learned about gradually. A club membership application that Marcus had submitted in the autumn went quiet. Not rejected, simply unacknowledged, which in the language of those institutions is its own kind of answer. A profile piece that a financial magazine had been preparing, a flattering account of Marcus's business acumen and the Holt Industries' growth trajectory, was quietly shelved by an editor, whose reasons remained private. Business partners who had been reliably available became, suddenly and without explanation, very busy with other things. None of it was loud. None of it announced itself. It moved the way real power moves, beneath the surface, in the space between what is said and what is understood, in the gap between a phone call that is returned and one that isn't. Marcus Holt was a man who had spent his life operating in that space. He knew, now, what it felt like to be on the other side of it. And then there was the complication. It came, as complications usually do, from the direction you aren't watching. Someone in Marcus's circle, I never learned exactly who, and I decided at some point that it didn't matter, began circulating a narrative. It moved through the specific social networks that such things move through. A whisper at one event, a raised eyebrow at another, a carefully worded concern expressed to someone who would carry it further. The narrative was this: that Clara Reyes was a schemer, that she had identified Daniel as a target and cultivated the relationship deliberately. That the Beaumont-Reyes connection was not an inheritance she had kept quiet out of respect for her mother's wishes, but a card she had been holding, waiting for the right moment to play. That the whole thing, the nurse, the overnight shifts, the humility, was a performance. Daniel heard it. Of course he heard it. The circles that these things travel through are not large, and Daniel moved in some of them, and the people who told him with the gentle urgency of people who believe they are doing him a service. He came home one evening with it written in the set of his jaw, in the particular quality of his silence, in the way he held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at the wall for a long time before he said anything. "Tell me," I said. So he told me. And then I told him. All of it. Not in pieces, not hedged, not with the careful sequencing I had always used when I thought about how to have this conversation eventually. All of it at once, from the beginning. My mother's choice, my grandfather's patience, the signet ring on the nightstand that he had already noticed and not pressed me on, the phone call in the car on the dark road home from the Manor, the architecture of what had followed. I told him what I had been and what I also was, and why I had kept those two things in separate rooms for my entire adult life, and what it had cost me to finally open the door between them. He listened the way Daniel always listens, with his whole body still and his whole attention present, without interruption, without the flinching that people sometimes do when a story gets too large for the container they built for it in their heads. He listened until I was done. Then he was quiet for a moment, the specific kind of quiet that is not absence but processing. And then he said, "Is this the part where I should tell you that none of this changes anything for me?" I said yes. He said, "None of this changes anything for me." And I believed him, completely, the way I have always believed Daniel Holt. Not because he is incapable of lying, but because I have spent 14 months learning what he looks like when he is telling the truth. And this was that. The counter-narrative died quietly. My grandfather handled it not with threats but with presence, a conversation, which I was not party to, between his senior counsel and the relevant parties in which certain things were made clear without being stated explicitly, in the time-honored tradition of people who have learned to communicate in that register. The story stopped circulating. No denial was issued. No statement was made. It simply ceased, the way things cease when the people sustaining them understand that the cost of continuing has exceeded any possible benefit. Marcus called Daniel on a Sunday in November. His voice, Daniel told me, was different, stripped of its calibrations, of the performance of authority it usually carried. He asked whether Daniel thought Clara might agree to have lunch. Just lunch. He said, please? Daniel said it was the first time he could remember his father using that word in a context where he wasn't being ironic about it. I agreed to lunch, not because I had forgiven Marcus Holt. I hadn't, not yet, and I was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of anyone's comfort, including Daniel's. Not because I needed anything from him. I agreed because Daniel loved his father, and Daniel's love deserved to be honored even when its object had not yet earned that honor, and because I still believed, as I have always believed, that people have some capacity to become other than what their worst moments made them. Not all people, not always, but some. If the thing that comes along is large enough and honest enough, and refuses to let them look away from the shape of their own smallness. The restaurant was quiet. Marcus arrived before me, which I noted. He stood when I came in, which I also noted. He looked at me differently, not with the appraising calculation that had been his default register, but with something more careful, more uncertain, more genuinely attentive. He asked about my work, not as a courtesy, not in the way that people ask about work when they are really asking about status, but with the quality of someone who has decided to actually listen to the answer. I told him about the overnight shifts. I told him about what it is to sit with someone in their last hours. He did not look away. When my grandfather's name came up, Marcus raised it, not me, he said, with a directness that was new in him. I understand that I misjudged the situation. I'd like to tell you I would have acted differently if I had known. But I think we both know that's not the kind of thing I should be saying to you. I looked at him for a moment. I said, no, it isn't. He nodded. We finished our lunch. He walked me to my car. He said thank you for coming. I said I was glad to. Neither of us made promises that would have been premature. Neither of us performed something we didn't yet feel. It was, in its modest and careful way, a beginning. My grandfather asks about Daniel at the end of every phone call. They have not yet met. We are taking that at whatever pace feels right, which is to say at the pace that belongs entirely to Daniel and me and no one else's schedule or expectation. Daniel is not intimidated by the prospect. He is, if anything, curious in the way he is curious about everything, with the open attentiveness of someone who approaches new information as interesting rather than threatening. My grandfather is patient. He has always been patient. Daniel found the signet ring one morning while I was sleeping. He had woken before me, he often does, and the ring had come off my finger in the night, which it sometimes does, and he found it on the sheet beside my hand and lifted it carefully and set it on the nightstand so it wouldn't get lost. And then he sat on the edge of the bed, and he looked at it. He looked at the worn crest, the gold rubbed almost smooth by time and by whoever had worn it before me, and he sat there long enough that I woke to find him like that, very still, with the ring on the nightstand and the question in his face too large to fit into words. I told him. All of it. That was how that conversation began, not with words, but with the ring and his face, and the silence that held the question he hadn't yet found language for. The lemon tart. This is the thing I return to at the end, when I want to remember the shape of the whole story. The lemon tart with no name, sitting on the dessert table at Ashbourne Manor with no attribution, made at 11 o'clock at night, by hands that believed in the gesture even when the room was designed to make it invisible. Daniel told me, weeks after the dinner, that he had found it on the dessert table and taken 2 slices. He said it was the best thing he had eaten all night. He said he had thought, eating it, that it tasted like something made by someone who cared, that it had a quality of attention in it that the rest of the table lacked. He had not known I had made it. He had not known until I told him, and when I told him, his face did the thing it does when he is trying not to let something show that is showing anyway. I said, "I'm glad it found its way to someone who deserved it." He laughed. I laughed. And the storm, the whole long, cold, humiliating, rearranging storm of it, finally, gently, ran out of rain. I still work nights at St. Brendan's. My hands are the same hands that pressed the pastry into the tin at 11 o'clock at night. The machines still beep in the same rooms. People still need someone to sit with them in the hours when nobody else is there. And I am still that person, present, attentive, carrying whatever steadiness I can bring in from the car park. My life did not change because of what my grandfather's name means. It clarified. I understood, standing in Marcus Holt's entrance hall with the 3 sentences on my phone screen, that I had always been exactly who I was, that the name and the ring and the weight were never separate from Clara Reyes, the nurse. They were always part of the same person, and that the only thing that had changed was that I had stopped keeping them in different rooms. I am still that person. I am also the other thing. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. This is what I want you to understand. Worth is not conferred. It is not granted by a table placement or a guest list or a man with an iron gate at the end of a gravel drive. It does not arrive when someone important enough finally recognizes it, because it was never waiting for that recognition. It was there before, indifferent to whether it was seen. It lives in you before anyone knows your name, and it lives in you after they learn it, and it is the only thing, in the end, that the Sylvies of this world can never survey correctly, because their instruments are calibrated for the wrong thing. They are measuring the signal. The signal is not the source. The source is always deeper, always quieter, always unimpressed by the noise around it. Character is revealed by how people treat those they believe are powerless. Marcus Holt revealed his. So did Sylvie. So did the woman to my left with her documentary survey, and the man to my right who looked through me for 3 hours. They revealed themselves completely, and they did it without knowing they were being watched by anything that mattered. That is what I want you to remember when you leave this story. That every room you walk into, every person you dismiss, every time you decide that someone does not warrant your full attention because they appear to occupy a lower rung, you are being watched, not necessarily by anyone with 14 digits in their grandfather's bank account, but by something, by the accumulating record of who you actually are, as distinct from who you would like people to think you are. The record is patient. It is always being kept. I think about my mother sometimes when I'm driving to the hospital in the early hours of the morning. She chose a life stripped of the weight she had been born into, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she wanted to know what she would build if she built from the ground. She built me. She built 29 years of ordinary, purposeful, quietly extraordinary days. She taught me that a dish made with care carries the care in it, that the gesture always matters even when the room is designed to make it invisible, that worth is not something you inherit or acquire, but something you practice, daily, in small specific acts. I carry all of that with me. I carry it into St. Brendan's every overnight shift. I carry it in the ring on my right hand. I carry it in the love of a man who chose me on a rainy Tuesday outside a coffee shop and has been choosing me every morning since, with coffee cups and paperback novels and hands held too tight. If this story found something in you, if you have ever stood in a room where someone looked through you as though you weren't there, if you have ever carried something quietly that the world around you had no idea how to measure, if you have ever made a lemon tart at 11 o'clock at night after a 10-hour shift and watched it sit unnamed on someone else's table, then you already know what I know. You already carry it. You have always carried it. The question is only whether you are ready yet to stop being afraid of what it weighs. Leave a comment below if you have ever been underestimated by someone who later had to reckon with exactly who you were. I want to hear it. I want every person who scrolls past this to know that they are not alone in the room, that the storm is not permanent, that the gravel driveway and the iron gates and the voice calibrated to carry are not the measure of anything that matters. Share this story if it moved you, because somewhere out there is someone standing in the rain with a casserole dish and a heart full of something no one in that house has yet learned to see. And they need to know, the way I needed to know, that the storm always eventually runs out of rain.